If you guys have been playing chess for any given amount of time, you guys must have surely heard of a pawn storm. Now, what exactly is a pawn storm and when should you use it in your own games? I will be answering these two questions coming straight up. So what exactly is a pawn storm? A pawn storm in chess is when you attack your opponent's king, whether it's on the king side or queen side, using your pawns as basically sacrificial material to try to open up lines and try to open up your opponent's king with a bang. If you've seen games of the most aggressive players in the world, for example, people like Garry Kasparov, Paul Morphy, and even Mikhail Tal, you guys must have definitely seen pawn storms. But the question is, when do you actually use pawn storms, and why do you use pawn storms to attack your opponent's king when pieces are generally good enough? Well, the reason is quite simple. Take this position in front of us, for example. This is a very classic opening. It's one of the most popular openings today. It's called the Najdorf in the Sicilian defense. And in this opening over here, you can kind of already see something that's very critical for you to spot if you want to start a pawn storm. And you guys can see that the king are both on opposite sides of the board. So why is this very important? The reason why this is important is because now you realize that the kings are on opposite sides of the board. We can move the pawns on the opposite side of the board to attack our opponent's king. White's going to be playing moves like g4, g5, h4, h5. Well, black's going to be doing the same thing. He's going to be playing b5, b4, a5, a4. How am I able to spot that so fast? It's because of the kings being on opposite sides. This is what I want to emphasize. Now, why are pawn storms able to do this? Why shouldn't you do a pawn storm when kings are on the same side of the board? And the reason is quite simple. When you're moving pawns forward, you're always, I want you guys to remember, creating weaknesses in your position that your opponent can easily attack. However, when your pawns become weaknesses when they're on the opposite side of the opponent's of your king and on the same side as your opponent's king, you actually don't care if the pawns are captured. In fact, in many positions, we actually sacrifice pawns in order to open up files for our rooks. Now, something that's very obvious is if we have more pieces to attack our opponent's king, guess what? The more chances we have to actually open up our opponent's king and actually win the game through checkmate, through sacrifices, through all that cool stuff you guys must have seen. So let me show you guys like what may happen. Like let's say pawn g4 happens, and then black plays pawn b5, we push, and then he pushes back, right? When it comes to pawn storm, something that's very critical for you guys to know as well is that speed is all that matters. You don't really care much about the material. You can sacrifice a pawn or two if it makes the attack faster. Because remember, what is white's plan? It's going to checkmate your king. What is your plan? Checkmate your opponent's king. Do you really care if you're really down a piece if you have an attack that's unstoppable? Probably not, because you probably just won the game, right? So in this position, after this and this, the white knight just goes back to e2 and the black knight goes to e8. And this is when people just continue the pawn storm, h4, a5, h5, ha4, and you just continue attack from here. You just keep attacking white with your pawns. You sacrifice pawns, for example, in these positions after this. The main line is usually knight bd4 because you just sacrifice the rook and that knight, but that's completely fine. You don't have to do that. Let's say he just messes up and he plays knight a1. This position's already kind of sketchy for white because black can just capture here, and his pawn storm is much faster than black's because black still has his 3 pawns in front of his king while white does not. But that's not the emphasis on today's video. What I want you to know is how powerful this can be. So you guys can see how the pawns are basically forcing white's pieces to retreat, making the defenders have less space, and when there's less space, it's always harder to defend your own pieces, right? You can see if white just dilly-dallies, let's say it's a pawn storm position like this one. Let's say you're playing the black side and then you're playing the white side actually, and he's just developing pieces like you guys learned in all those beginner videos, and your opponent's just starting to move his pieces up, right? He's just going for a pawn storm, and then you go h4. You're not going to go for anything. You're just going to play queen c7. You're just trying to develop the pieces, right? You're going to play pawn h5. You're just going to start steamrolling your pawns down. Let's see what will happen. Let's say your opponent, I don't know what they can play here. Let's say they play the pawn storm a little bit too late. They play pawn b5 now. Now in this position, we have a lot of moves we can play. We can play knight d5, we can play knight d4, we can play king b1, but this is a possible move. We can play g6, and it's a very typical idea. It might not be the best move in this position, but the idea is quite simple. If our opponent messes up and decides to capture us, then guess what? We may have sacrificed a pawn, we may be down a pawn right now, but guess what? We have attacks against our opponent's king very, very fast, right? We have moves like queen h2, we have moves like knight d5. We're just bringing in more pieces to attack our opponent's king. If he makes this silly mistake of capturing, we have this check, rook f7, and then now we have very nice moves like rook d2, just bringing this rook over. How is our opponent going to stop this checkmating threat on the h file? Because we opened up a file, our opponent has to deal with the threats that we're giving him. And because there are so many threats, well, guess what? Our opponent is going to lose. Because remember, the most important thing in these positions is that we, as a player, as white, just open up the position and attack our opponent over and over and over again. Let's take a look at a game between two past world champions, with the Boris Spassky playing as white here and Petrosian playing as black. And in this position, I want us to look at it from the black's perspective. As you can see, white's pawn storm hasn't gone anywhere because black has locked it all up, while black's pawn storm still has many moves that can be made to attack white's king. As you can see in this position, white is already up in exchange because black sacrificed it so he can get better avenues of attack. And if you're looking at this position, I want you to think to yourself who you think is better in this position. Is it white because he has more material, or do you think it's black because he has a pawn storm happening? And if you guys have been paying attention to today's video or have been listening whatsoever, you guys would probably know black is absolutely crushing here. Because after this move h3, white's king is getting blown apart. There's nothing white can really do to stop his king from being attacked from all sides now. After this h3 move, white tried to play bishop f1 with maybe the idea of capturing here and then bishop captures after that. And after rook h3, black is threatening to capture here, and after king captures, just play the simple rook h2 check and attack the opponent's rook. As you can see, white's attack is now going nowhere. There's nothing going to happen here, while black's attack is going all out. You always have to be scared here. Then what is white going to do to defend? And every move he uses to defend, guess what? He's not using to attack his opponent's king, which means black is in the driver's seat, no matter what the material stance is. After this, white captures, and after black captures, again, he's threatening bishop takes here now, this tactic, checking the opponent's king. So the king just goes to g1, and after captures, white decided to capture with the king on f1. Now in this position, we want to open up the position even more. Sure, these checks might work, like if we check, he uses king moves here and we check again, then guess what? The opponent's king kind of escapes. So what black does is he decides to open up the position even more with this incredible e4 idea. Because the idea is if either piece captures, let's say pawn captures, then we can move this pawn to f3, and guess what? There's no stopping our rook from going to h1. Look how powerful these pawns are, stopping the white king from ever running away. These two pawns are worth more than a rook and possibly even a queen in this position due to how strong they are. Now, I didn't mention this before when I was talking about pawn storms, but the pawns don't have to get sacrificed if they can become very useful attackers in the position. So after this, after a4 was played, queen f3 was played. The idea is if you capture me, I'm going to capture back with the queen. But here, black just says, you know what? I'm going to sacrifice my knight now. With the idea, hey, if you capture me, well, we'll see what happens. But the idea is if you don't capture it, then guess what? We just have another piece coming into the game, and one more piece is always going to be very hard for you to defend. Something to note is, as you can see, black's attack is happening while white's attack is going nowhere. You never want to be in this situation where your opponent has a pawn storm, but you don't, because that just means you're on the receiving end of a large beating. And in chess is a very aggressive game. So if you don't attack and your opponent doesn't blunder, there's no way you can win. So you want to always be on the attacking side in a pawn storm. So after this, pawn captures, and then the f3 move comes in anyways. And what did I say about these pawns? They're incredibly strong. They're threatening a checkmate in 1. And so in this position, white just moved rook to g2, and after this capture, white actually resigned. The incredible Boris Spassky resigned this game, because no matter what he does, well, guess what? This pawn is a menace. It's super duper strong. We could play moves like rook h2, check, and after rook h2 check, there's actually a cool checkmate in 7 moves. Now I don't expect you guys to find it, that's not the purpose of today's video again, but it's actually very cool a checkmate, so I'll just show you guys it. If you guys can solve it, tell me in the comment section below. Queen h6, and then in this position, queen f3 is actually, funnily enough, the best move, because in this position, if we do anything else, then we have check here and checkmate, and there's actually no other way to stop it. If you decide to take here, then we check you over here, king g2, queen h2 check, and after king f3, the final finishing touch with our supporting pawn on g3 and checkmate in 1. So as you can see in this position, Boris Spassky, the great world champion of the past, fell for a pawn storm, and pawn storms are super, super dangerous at the highest levels to the lowest of levels. And if you can catch your opponent unaware, and if they don't know what a pawn storm is and don't do one when you are castled on the opposite side, then guess what? You're most likely to win, and I can guarantee you that. So I hope to see you guys play pawn storms in your own positions, in your own games, and tell me in the comment section below if you guys have done a very, very nice pawn storm in your past, or playing a nice pawn storm right now, and I would be happy to hear in the comments below. I hope you guys learned something in today's video all about pawn storms. So if you want to watch a video in which you learn when to exchange pieces and when not to exchange pieces, I would highly recommend watching that video over there.